$17 billion project to put a data center in Georgia that is apparently going to take more power than a nuclear reactor would typically deliver. Massive project, and eminent domain is being used to usher people out of their homes to make way for this. I think it's an 800-acre project and all of the lines that will have to feed it. So can we show the video of a young woman, 27 years old, I think her name is Ainsley Brown, who has caught the attention of a large fraction of the public here.
Hey you guys, my name's Ainsley. I live in Coweta County, Georgia. I wanted to come out here and show you guys firsthand what is happening to our county. So as you can see behind me, we have these power lines. Georgia Power is going to expand these lines to support power to the data center. What they're doing to homeowners is they're taking their homes. This is my childhood home behind me. It is being taken by force by Georgia Power. Homeowners in this county do not have a choice. It is called eminent domain, and they will take it.
Okay, so she's put up several videos highlighting homeowners. One of her other videos, a homeowners having part of their property commandeered. So some massive right-of-way is going to be put through their backyard. It's going to eliminate their pool. And she actually has the homeowner there, and the person says, look, we're too old to rebuild what we've built here. Yes, they did offer to buy the entire home if we wanted that, but for a fraction of what it's worth. And so basically they're being put in this utterly impossible position, even before you consider what it might mean to be that close to lines carrying that much power with that much of an electromagnetic field. But I wanted to put this in context, because if you take what I said earlier in the broadcast about there's a thing with a ton of power, and it's now doing exactly the thing that the American founders feared when they constructed our country, something we're supposed to be able to prevent. What it is doing is it is using the terrifying power of government to do what other people who are able to buy their influence over the system want done, irrespective of the harm to us. And in my house, eminent domain was a relatively frequent topic of discussion. My grandfather remembered the story of Chavez Ravine, in which a bunch of
in LA
Latin American immigrants were thrown out of their homes to make way for Dodger Stadium. It was something, he was a Los Angelino, and he had lived through this period. And so anyway, he talked to us about eminent domain. This was not, I think, a clear-cut case of it, the Chavez Ravine case, for a reason that I think people need to understand. So eminent domain apparently goes back into antiquity, and nobody knows how far back, but it derives from the fact that the monarch was presumed to have the right to do anything that he wanted to do. That begins to get limited with the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta outlines that we, the public, actually have rights, and our Constitution is derived from the Magna Carta. Our Constitution actually formally enshrines eminent domain with a limit in the Fifth Amendment. And what the Fifth Amendment says is that government cannot deprive you of your property without just compensation.
Yeah.
So you have two concepts there, or three concepts. One is the government can deny you, it can take your property, but it cannot do it not only without compensating you, but the compensation has to be just. It can't cheat you. And so the way eminent domain is supposed to work is if there is a public project, then the government can decide you are in the way of this public project. We have the right to buy it from you, but we will buy it from you for what it's worth, so you can go buy something of similar value somewhere else. That's the way it's supposed to work. This gets complicated in the 19th century as a result of railroads. And the reason that railroads complicate the issue is that railroads obviously cut through an arbitrary set of properties, because where you put the railroad is dictated by the form of the land. There are mountains that rails can't climb, so you put them where they go, and the point is, well, who was there beforehand? Do they have a right to keep their property and stop a railroad? Well, no, But unlike the government saying, well, we're going to buy your property and put in a railroad, it's private corporations putting in the railroad. So in this case, the courts in a case called Bloodgood versus Moak and Hudson, that case in 1837 enshrines the government's right to exert eminent domain in cases where the entity doing the building is actually private. Now, in the case of railroads, now knowing the history of the country, I think we can all recognize that although that's a frightening barrier to breach, it's understandable why. It was in the interests of the public. It was certainly in the interests of all sorts of barons to be able to take property, but it was in the interest of the nation to have a system of railroads that facilitated the transportation of people and goods.
And many of us would argue that it's not in the interest of the nation to have all of those things themselves be governmental services.
Right.
Right. So if we want to keep eminent domain entirely governmental, that means that we are arguing for the public nature of all of the major services, which many more of us now than 10 years ago even would argue sounds like an invitation to tyranny. And no, we don't want that.
Yep, exactly. So you don't want the creation of a public bureaucracy where private enterprise is going to do a better job of doing the work. You need something public spirited to balance the rights of individuals against the rights of the nation to do things that are actually in our interest, right? And I think every reasonable person would agree that it is both frightening and that there are cases in which it is likely necessary. Now, when an entity that is doing this is private without government power, in other words, when somebody wants to put up a shopping center or another private enterprise, they have to buy you out for what you want, right? So most people...
You get to set your price.
Right. You get to set your price. This is traditional. So you get to set your
And
price.
that was established with the, whatever it was, Bloodgood versus Mohawk and Hudson?
That Bloodgood versus Mohawk and Hudson is basically the erosion of this principle. The originally, if the government said it since the Constitution, if the government said we get to take your property, they had to justly compensate you, and you couldn't say no. A private enterprise didn't have that power, which then creates a game theoretic.
But justly compensate doesn't say anything about whether or not you get to set your price.
No, justly compensated doesn't say that. The government gets to determine what your property is worth the same way that they assess its value currently in order to figure out what to tax you on it.
So I was just curious about when I get to set my own price if you're going to take my land shows up.
You don't get to do that when it's the government. You do get to do it when it's a purely private enterprise like a shopping center.
Okay.
And so that creates actually an interesting phenomenon, something Eric pointed out to me many years ago, which is something called, in China, they would be called nail houses. In the West, they're often called holdout houses. But anyway, I've sent Jen a few images of these things. So this one, I believe, is actually in Seattle. Here's somebody who refused to sell their property, and I think it might be an apartment complex was put up around it.
Can't be fun, though.
This one, I believe, is in China. I don't know how yet. So it's amazing, actually, how many of them are in China, which does not really fit with my understanding of how China has worked. But this person has obviously...
So for people listening, what are we looking at?
We're looking at a house that appears to be in the middle of some kind of road. How that works, I don't know.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead. Here's another same thing, a house smack dab in the middle of a road. You got to admire these people. Here's a place where a giant excavation for some sort, this is again is in China. And I think that the roof of this one says SOS on it.
But this doesn't make any sense because the building is built at the bottom of the quarry.
I think something has been built up around it in preparation for.
Okay.
Okay. Next one. This one I think is fascinating. This is a grave site that somebody refused to allow to be moved. So an excavation has been done around it, and it's now sitting on like an artificial mesa.
Wow.
And then that one is in Chicago.
I was going to say, that looks like the U.S.
Yeah, that's a Chicago. It's like an old...
And that's beautiful.
townhouse.
Like that actually really reveals like the buildings around it in this case aren't by any means the ugliest modern buildings you've ever seen, but they are so hideous by comparison to that whatever, late 19th century, early 20th century architecture that remains.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. And the contrast is really, really stunning here.
Yeah.
But anyway, the point is, if it's purely a private enterprise, you get to say no, which means you can set your price. And ultimately, if you refuse to sell, they have to build around you. If the government wants your property, it gets to set the price, and you don't get the right to say no. And then with the
Data centers.
the Bloodgood railroad decision, we breach that boundary and we start to blur this distinction. And the government can now liberate you of your property using eminent domain and hand it to a developer when it deems it in the public's interest. And then there's another decision that makes this even worse later on. This is Kelo versus the City of New London in 2005.
That's in the U.S. though?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
So Connecticut?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it, for the first time, enshrines into law the idea that you can be liberated of your, what was their term? Your, I think, unblighted home. That a perfectly good home can be taken from you if it's part of an economic renewal project for your neighborhood, right? So they can give it to a developer. So this spooked a lot of states, and something more than 45 states have enacted either constitutional provisions or laws to prevent this from happening in those states. But in any
Are we among them?
we are not among them. I think, we are among them. We are among them. But in any case, what I want to highlight here with the Georgia Project and Ansley Brown and her pointing to these homeowners who have done nothing to deserve this, they are having their homes liberated by government, which is not paying them just value. And
why are you using their term of liberation? This seems like a disgusting use of that.
They're having their homes stolen by government on behalf of a private developer for a project that none of us signed off on, right? Notice we have not had the proper public discussion to say whether or not we want massive data centers with massive energy and water requirements, or we want the right to decide collectively where those things should go, what limits should be put on them. The idea is if it's progress, we're going to do it. It's all private.
But that's not new, right? Like presumably there was no giant, lots of people involved discussion about the railways. That was obviously well before our time, but there was no giant, lots of people involved discussion about wind farms or giant solar farms.
But here's the difference.
Both of which are now, I think, increasingly widely understood to have been extraordinary mistakes.
Yep. So here's my argument, and historians may correct me here. But once upon a time, we did send representatives to represent us in discussions where those things were decided. I'm not an expert on data centers. I don't know what their energy requirements are, what might come in the future. I don't know any of those things. I'm not supposed to have to. I'm supposed to have a representative who stands for me in those conversations and decides whether or not it's actually in the public's interest, A, to have these things, B, to put them here rather than there. I'm not involved in those discussions. I'm entitled to be, but I'm not, right?
Whereas, but separately, we see evidence that the people whom we have elected to represent us have no idea what's going on.
They have,
so that's the connection here?
Yes, they have no idea what's going on, or if they do, they're actually working for somebody else whose name I don't know. And
they may not even know.
Right. And the thing that is absolutely clearest here is we all, if we imagine that we, the public, all have symmetrical rights with each other, we all have the right and should want eminent domain to be held to, not only in terms of the sober responsibility of taking your property from you, but the obligation to pay justly for it. right? The fact that the state does not represent us, of course they would cheat and pay you too little. Of course they would. That's the whole point, right? The point is, this isn't about you. Frankly, we'll pay whatever we can get away with. If we could take your property without paying you anything, we'd do it because it's never going to happen to us, right? The people running the system are not the people living under the system. They have exemptions. When they decide that they're going to surveil us, they presumably know how the surveillance works. They have mechanisms to avoid their stuff from registering. So
most states have property taxes.
Yep.
Maybe all states, I'm not sure. Property taxes historically, famously, lag the actual value of the property somewhat. You don't necessarily get reassessed until you sell, but it should be reassessed more often than not. But most places, there's a lag, but there's not a really substantive lag. It seems to me that at baseline, just at the worst case scenario, should be the benchmark by which homeowners are being told what their homes are worth, given that they've been paying taxes into the system based on that assessed value.
Yes, I agree. And I don't know what the assessed value of these homes is and whether that is setting the price that's being paid for them. But I think the overarching picture is clear. Eminent domain is now showing up again. Why? Because data centers are suddenly necessary. Huge energy requirements are necessary. The right of way to get the energy from place to place, the power plants that are going to have to be put up. Eminent domain is coming. There is not, I've seen several people argue, and frankly, I don't know if there's a good counter argument to it, but sounds compelling to me on first pass. Why aren't we sticking these data centers in the blighted parts of Detroit? You know, there you have a block on block of abandoned buildings. There's obviously economic stagnation. If you were going to put them somewhere where you're not taking, where you're taking houses from as few people as possible, where
you potentially unblight an area.
You unblight an area.
I mean, not that data centers are beautiful, but it's better than.
Well, let's put it this way. I don't know long term whether there are a lot of jobs associated with these things. My guess is they're going to run with not that large a population of people. I don't know, but building them is certainly going to require a lot of labor. So, you know, maybe the point is Detroit could have I mean, look, I don't mean to pick on Detroit, but the point is if you've been to Detroit,
we just happen to have lived near Detroit for many years. And so you're familiar with its very sad state. So
there are places that this would not be a giant step down, right? It would be industrial rather than residential, but there are places where you wouldn't want to live anyway. And so, and if that came with a big influx of money because somebody's putting in, you know, a $17 billion structure, then that brings in money that could be used for urban revitalization or whatever. So again, I don't know if there's a flaw. I don't know if that's just, you know, what it looks, you know, not in my backyard, but okay, that's okay in your backyard.
Right.
I don't know if that's what I'm seeing, but at least I see an argument for it. And unfortunately, nobody is minding the store on our behalf. The power of government is terrifying. It has been captured by entities that we have no influence over. And it is now using that. You can see it. Eminent domain is the tip of the spear, right? It's coming for us. It's coming for our houses. Our right to say no doesn't exist because the Constitution says the government has the right to take that property. And no kidding, they're going to underassess it and pay you too little. Because why wouldn't they? What do they care about you and your ability to recreate your life somewhere else? They don't. So anyway, that be the picture as I see it.